Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents and US history. Today is May the 4th, 2026. I'm going to be continuing my discussion on the first cabinet. Um, the first cabinet of of President George Washington, appears to have been the most brilliant cabinet we've ever had, and it set the tone, right? It set the tone, the template for subsequent cabinet secretaries. Of course, our very first cabinet had just four cabinet members. That's not including the vice president or the postmaster general. The vice president, of course, was John Adams. He didn't attend cabinet meetings, and of course, he famously or infamously described the office of the vice president as the most insignificant office conceived by man's imagination. Um, and so there were four cabinet members, right, that were recognized. That's the Secretary of State, who was Thomas Jefferson. Um, there was the Secretary of the Treasury, who was Alexander Hamilton, and of course there was the Secretary of War, who was Henry Knox, and then there was the Attorney General, who was Edmund Randolph, who was of course Thomas Jefferson's cousin. Interestingly, the uh, the position of Attorney General, right, is not in the U.S. Constitution, but it was created in the Judiciary Act of 1789, right, which passed later on in September 1789. And the position was conceived by Congress as a part-time role, right? That's the position of Attorney General. It was conceived as a part-time role, and it didn't have a department, right? It was just a one-person job, just for one person. That's the Attorney General. He wasn't head of a department, and his role was to serve as an advisor to an advisor on legal matters to the president and to the cabinet secretaries. And cabinet secretaries were called principal officers in the Constitution, and to represent uh, to represent the executive, right, in the Supreme Court, right. That was the role of the Attorney General. I think today it's the Solicitor General, which is under the Attorney General, who normally argues before the U.S. Supreme Court. So you see, roles have evolved over time. And so from the four cabinet member, we now have 16 cabinet members in the United States, which is significant, right? Considering our size and our status and our power, we haven't bloated up the cabinet office. We haven't bloated the cabinet offices like, I know Nigeria, right? My other country, originally from Nigeria. Nigeria has, I understand, over 40 cabinet, over 40 cabinet positions. But I digress. So the, it was George Washington who decided to make the position of Attorney General a full cabinet post, right? Instead of a part time position. It was meant to be part time. George Washington decided to make him a full time cabinet member. Now, the Department of Justice, however, was not created until 1870 under the great Ulysses S. Grant, right? President Grant, our 18th president, was one who created the Department of Justice. And it's interesting that the Department of Justice was actually originally created to advocate and prosecute cases and protecting the civil rights of the newly freed African American slaves, right? And they went after the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So it's interesting that the civil rights, the protection of civil rights, that was the original reason that the Department of Justice was created under President Ulysses S. Grant in 1870. Um, Now, another interesting thing is the position of the postmaster General, because the Postmaster General had been established. I've seen history books who've called the Postmaster General as being part of the uh, cabinet of George Washington in the first, in the first administration. However, um, there was a guy who had served as Postmaster General. That's Thomas Pickering, the Harvard graduate and lawyer Thomas Pickering. He had been a Postmaster General, but he was not a cabinet member until he became Secretary of War. Right, he replaced Henry Knox, who was a general, and then he subsequently became Secretary of State. Right after the departure of Thomas Jefferson. He subsequently became a Secretary of State. So the Postmaster General was not a although very important position. It was an important position because our first Postmaster General was Benjamin Franklin, right? Nobody less significant than Benjamin Franklin. So you can see government offices in the beginning were very significant, very important. Benjamin Franklin, of course, was a genius. He was a great autodidact. They called him Dr. Benjamin Franklin because he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Civil Law by Oxford University for his accomplishments in science, right, in electricity and things like that. Um, he didn't have a formal education himself, but very widely read. Back then, our founding fathers were autodidacts, right? They believed in learning on their own. They read a lot. They improved themselves. So Benjamin Franklin held the position first as Postmaster General. Very important position, especially during the war, right? With regard to the transmission of secrets communication and things like that, or intercepting British intelligence, or making sure British didn't intercept their communication and things like that. So it was a very important position. That's Postmaster General. By the way, the it was uh, Benjamin Franklin's son-in-law uh, replaced him as Postmaster General, but it wasn't a cabinet position during George Washington's presidency. The Postmaster General, however, did become a cabinet level position uh, under President Andrew Jackson. Sorry, Andrew Jackson. In 1829, Andrew Jackson was our seventh president. Right, he succeeded John Quincy Adams. So Andrew Jackson made the Postmaster General uh, a cabinet level appointment. So it was the post office department, and this was the case up until 1971. In 1971, it was removed as a cabinet, as a cabinet level, um, as a it was no longer a cabinet uh, level position. That's a Postmaster General. The with the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970. So the post office was reorganized as an independent agency. It was not under any cabinet secretary. So the it has a board of trustees, and of course, there's a uh, postmaster general. So the that's the U.S. Postal Services became an independent agency. So it's not a cabinet level position again. So from 1829 to 1971, the Postmaster General was a cabinet level official. It was a cabinet secretary. That's the Postmaster General. Um, and as I said, Thomas Pickering, even though he was a cabinet member under George Washington, and he'd also been a postmaster general, but he wasn't a postmaster. He wasn't a cabinet uh, secretary. He wasn't a cabinet level appointee, cabinet member while he was serving as postmaster general. It was after he became Secretary of War, after Henry Knox left, and uh, that he became a cabinet member. That's Thomas Pickering. Um, and I want to point out how the first cabinet, right? The first cabinet was virtually an aristocracy of lawyers because virtually everybody that was a cabinet member was a lawyer, except with the exception of Henry Knox, right? Henry Knox was a general. He was, Secretary of War, so he didn't need to be a lawyer. But it's interesting that his successor, Thomas Pickering, was a lawyer. He had a Harvard degree and he was a lawyer. That's Thomas Pickering. And the next person who was still within the administration of George Washington, who became Secretary of War, who was not a lawyer, was the physician and surgeon. It was a physician, medical doctor, physician, surgeon. That's James McHenry. James McHenry was the first person who was an immigrant who held a cabinet um, position. James McHenry was not born in the United States. He was born in Ireland. He immigrated in his teens from Ireland. So he was Scots Irish, James McHenry. Every other person was a lawyer. So we had an aristocracy of lawyers, right? Every other person was a lawyer. Now, it's interesting also that the cabinet secretaries, um, they were men of all seasons. They were dual hatted, right? They wore many hats, right? Today our American professionals are specialists. We over specialize and they know just one thing. Back then, people wore many different hats, right? And they could move around. So people were men of all seasons, jack of all trades. They were polymaths, right? So they learned many different things and they were experts in many different things. So you see Thomas Pickering, he had been Postmaster General, he was a lawyer, he went to Harvard, he served as Secretary of War, he would serve as Secretary of State. So they wore many different hats. In fact, there was an Attorney General, Charles Lee. Charles Lee would serve as a Secretary of State as well. Now, John Jay, interestingly, had served as Secretary of Foreign Affairs before the position of Secretary of State was created. And he actually served as the first Secretary of State. He was acting Secretary of State because when the position of Secretary of State was created, um, George Washington had Thomas Jefferson in mind. Thomas Jefferson at that time was minister or ambassador to France at that time. And so um, John Jay, right, served as the acting Secretary of State. So he was sort of the placeholder. Interestingly, though, prior to the establishment of the position of Secretary of State, there was a position of Secretary of Foreign Affairs, which served the same, sort of an equivalent role, Secretary of Foreign Affairs. And the Secretary of Foreign Affairs was John Jay. And John Jay was also serving as our first Chief Justice of the United States. So you can see he was a cabinet member and at the same time was Chief Justice of the United States, right? Of course, the Chief Justice of the United States, the position wasn't big. It wasn't, um, it didn't, until today, well, today, so the position of Chief Justice of the United States, it's not like it started off as a diminished office. No, because it was in our Constitution of 1787. It's the Article 3. It's in Article 3. There's Article 1 is the Congress, Article 2 is the executive under the president, and Article 3 is the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Chief Justice is actually mentioned in Article 1, Section 3, that the Chief Justice presides over presides when the Senate tries the president for impeachment, right? And we've had three Chief Justices who've actually presided in the impeachment hearings of the president. The first was Salmon P. Chase in the impeachment of um, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the 17th president and first president to be impeached. But of course, they've all escaped. They've all been acquitted, right? They've all been acquitted. And then the next one was Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who presided over the impeachment of President Bill Clinton, and Chief Justice John Roberts presided over the first impeachment hearing of um, uh, President Donald Trump, number 45 and number 47, who was our incumbent president. He declined, that's Chief Justice John Roberts, he declined to preside over the second impeachment hearings, and a senator would preside. I think it was the Leahy, right? Senator Leahy would preside over it. Um, Now, so interestingly, John Jay, as I was saying, the role of the Chief Justice uh, uh, is very, it's significant. It's not to be minimized. Um, Interestingly, the Chief Justice is a very political role. Now, we didn't start off with having nine Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. There have been recent rancor about packing the courts, increasing the number of the Supreme Court justices because they've been talking about the politicization of the Supreme Court because there's um, six conservative justices appointed by Republicans, and there are only three. Um, Three of them you know, are Democratic, right? So uh, the Supreme Court has always the justices have always been political, right? They've always been political, unfortunately, from our inception. John Jay was a politician. He was actually he left the Supreme Court and became governor of New York. It's interesting. We've actually had a Supreme Court Chief Justice, Charles Evans Hughes or Charles Hughes Evans, or he ran for presidency several times. We've had Earl Warren, Chief Justice Warren, one of our most consequential, significant Chief Justices, because he did preside over the court during the famous Brown versus Board of Education, which ended segregation, right? It made segregation unconstitutional. Um, Chief Justice Earl Warren had actually been governor of California, right, our largest state. Now, so it's interesting that our very first Chief Justice had been a Secretary of State, acting Secretary of State, and he had been Secretary of Foreign Affairs when the position existed prior to the position of uh, prior to it being replaced by this position of Secretary of State, right? So you can see that the role of the Chief Justice was sort of as a chief diplomat, chief politician. Of course, his other roles, he serves as the chief administrative judge of the federal courts because the federal courts, right, the circuit courts, federal courts, they are under the Supreme Court of the United States, or under the Supreme Court. And so they've been, the Chief Justice John Jay, his personality, his position, his role sort of set the tone of the Chief Justice as sort of the chief diplomat on the Supreme Court. He's a diplomat. He's the one who is a politician, and it's significant. I've discussed this before, done a video talking about how we've had a president, our 27th president, William Howard Taft. He would go on after he lost the presidency. He would go on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he's the only former president, to ever become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's William Howard Taft. Um, Interestingly, like I said, the first Supreme Court constituted of only six justices, right? So there are just six, not nine. Um, One of them, after Chief Justice John Jay retired and um, went on to become governor of New York, was William Cushing. William Cushing was a member of the original court, right? The first five associate justices, and of course there was one Chief Justice, making them six. He was offered and confirmed as the to become the Supreme Court's the Chief Justice, but he declined it, right? So there have actually been a couple who've declined the position. Interestingly, there was a guy who was a justice, an associate justice. So an associate justice of the Supreme Court can be elevated. He could be raised to become a chief justice, right? Sometimes the president can just appoint somebody from outside and make him Chief Justice. Interestingly, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court today earns $320,000, $320,700. So he is paid the most. He's paid higher than the other associate justices. The other associate justices earn roughly about $306,000, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court earns more. So about, say almost $15,000 more than the other associate justices. Um, I'm going to do a video and discuss, our chief justices, the Supreme Court. Since I'm a lawyer, I'm not licensed to practice law, but I like to discuss the law. I discuss cases, and the judiciary is very important. It was one of our original grievances, in the Declaration of Independence, the administration of justice. Right, our founding fathers had a grievance about how the king did not administer justice fairly, and there was no rule of law and things like that. So we wanted, they argued that the king had established a kangaroo court, right, and the Supreme Court, the judiciary was not independent, but that they existed upon the will of the king. So the I'm going to do a video and discuss the U.S. Supreme Court. But again, it's interesting that the first cabinet, the first two administrations of the first cabinet members in the administration of the first two administrations of President George Washington was an aristocracy of lawyers. It was made of over 80%, roughly 81.8% lawyers, right? They were all lawyers except Henry Knox, who was Secretary of War, and also the uh, the Secretary of War that succeeded him, James McHenry. James McHenry was a physician, he was a surgeon, and he'd been a protege of the famous physician who was a founding father. That's Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush, of course, had been the one who reconciled our two presidents, the frenemies, John Adams, our second president, and Thomas Jefferson, our third president. Um, so it's interesting, though, that the Treasury, so at the beginning, the largest department that existed was the Treasury Department. So Alexander Hamilton was the most powerful cabinet member because he ran administered the largest department by far. The Treasury Department was very significant because it dealt with the money, right? It dealt with money. We had a lot of debts. The money was very important with the prosecution of our wars, paying of the soldiers, and just so many things. So this was the largest department by far, the Treasury Department. It was the real only department that had any real significance. The Attorney General was a one-man show, and our Attorney Generals were people who became Attorney General in the two administrations of George Washington were Edmund Randolph, right? He graduated from College of William and Mary, and he was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. He was a lawyer, and there was also um, William Bradford. William Bradford graduated from Princeton. He was from Pennsylvania. He'd been an associate justice of Pennsylvania's Supreme Court. He'd been Attorney General of Pennsylvania, and he was a lawyer. And after him, there was Charles Lee. Charles Lee was from Virginia, but he also graduated from Princeton. He was a Federalist, a loyalist of uh, Alexander Hamilton. So Charles Lee, although he was from Virginia, he was a member of Virginia's House of Delegates. He became Secretary of State, by the way. He was also Secretary of State. He was Attorney General, but he was Secretary of State. Um, and I've discussed the significance of the Postmaster General under Thomas Pickering. Thomas Pickering was Harvard educated. He was a lawyer. He started off as Secretary of War. He had been Postmaster General uh, and he became Secretary of State. He was also a Federalist, a loyalist of Alexander Hamilton. Um, so, uh, and then the Treasury Department was, after Alexander Hamilton left, it was um, it was led by his protege, uh, the brilliant Oliver Wolcott Jr., who was a Yale graduate. He came from a prominent family in Connecticut. He'd been auditor of the U.S. Treasury Department. He'd been comptroller, and he became a judge. So he was a lawyer, very talented cabinet, very brilliant. It was an aristocracy of lawyers, right? So they set the tone in America. You can see lawyers are still very important today. They are, it's the most recurrent profession uh, of our presidents, right? 70%, roughly 70% of our presidents have been lawyers. Um, it's the most recurrent. Also, it's the most recurrent profession in in the House of Congress and in the Senate as well. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll do other videos discussing the Supreme Court and the Department of Justice. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.